Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. Happy New Year as well. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles for another year, at least.
At least one more year, guys.
No
Yeah, let's
promises
do it.
beyond that, but
I mean, who can promise beyond that? That's already a pretty
yes.
big promise, a full year. It's January
Mhm.
after all. And our first episode back from our little end of the year, beginning of the year break. And, we're in the process of finishing the Powder Mage trilogy. So while we are busy doing that, we have a new book to discuss today. This is one that I decided to pick up during our little holiday break. It was a book that I had bought forever ago and has just been tantalizing me from the bookshelf for all this time. This beautiful, brightly colored copy of The City We Became, a novel by N.K. Jemisin, book one of what I believe is called The Great Cities duology.
Mm,
So, The City We Became.
wow. A duology. And I know you've been enjoying this book, Charles, because you didn't even show up to the FTF holiday party. I know you were too busy, too engrossed
I don't think I
in
was
the.
invited to the FDF holiday party. This is the first time I'm hearing about it.
Oh, it must have got lost in the mail. But
Oh, I see. I
yeah, you
see.
were super engrossed in the city we became. And
Hmm.
I haven't read the book, but I'm not surprised that you had a great time with it because it's by three-time Hugo Award-winning author N.K. Jemisin, who I've read her entire Broken Earth trilogy, and you read the fifth season. Was that this last year? Who
Hmm.
can even tell at this point? But
Hmm.
Charles, rather than continuing with her Hugo Award winning series that has every single book being a Hugo Award winner, you decided to take a different route, and
Hmm.
you took that right route all the way into the city we became.
That is well said, Dylan. It's interesting. I had read the fifth season, like you said, on the show. We discussed it. And instead of picking up the other two, there's a reason I jumped into the city we became. But before I say that, I just want to correct the record. She is a four-time Hugo Award winner,
Oh
but she
no!
is famous for sweeping the Hugos for three consecutive years for her Broken Earth trilogy. So
What was the
that's
fourth one?
the fourth Hugo was for Best Novelette in 2020 for Emergency Skin. That was
Interesting.
also around the same time that she released this book. I believe The City We Became was a Goodreads Choice Award nominee for Best Fantasy. Not quite the same thing as winning a
Yeah.
Hugo, but still a pretty distinguished award, of course. It did not win, but there's a reason I read this one because I was visiting family in Queens. And so I was like, I'm going to be in the city. I'm going to be in Queens for like 5 days, six
Queens
days.
isn't the city, Charles. You've
Yes, it
been
is.
living out
It's
of
one
New
of the
York too
five
long.
boroughs,
It's
my
one of the
friends.
boroughs. It's one of the boroughs. But if you're saying the city, I mean, you're talking
I mean, I was
Manhattan.
in Manhattan and Brooklyn and everywhere else. We were staying in Queens, which, if you were to read this book, Dylan, you would know it is part of the city. I have definitive proof right here. By you're
That
saying
they
four-time
consider
Hugo
Queens to be part
Award-winning
of the
N.K.
city.
Jemisin is wrong, then if that's where you're going. And so I'd tread carefully with that position there. But
Right.
yes, I was in one of the boroughs of New York City, and I was like, this is a great way to get me in the mood of New York. And it was a very strategic pick on my part. It ended up really kind of setting the scene for my whole trip, which I greatly appreciated because this is a story firmly rooted in New York, and there's, New York isms all over the place. But before I get too far into that, why don't I start with a little back of the book, or I guess inside cover, because it's one of those fancy ones that just has a bunch of praise for N.K. Jemisin. Not even this book. Most of it is just for her as an individual. This one is Neil Gaiman actually praising this book, and then the rest are just other stuff. You know how they do that. But I'll just dive into the back of the insert here. So, in Manhattan, a young grad student gets off the train and realizes he doesn't remember who he is, where he's from, or even his own name. But he can sense the beating heart of the city, see its history, and feel its power. In the Bronx, a Lenape gallery director discovers strange graffiti scattered throughout the city, so beautiful and powerful, it's as if the paint is literally calling to her. In Brooklyn, a politician and mother finds she can hear the songs of her city pulsing to the beat of her Louboutin heels. And they're not the only ones. Every great city has a soul. Some are ancient as myths, and others are as new and destructive as children. New York City, she's got six. And that is The City We
Ooh,
Became by N.K. Jemisin.
wow.
Yep.
So I didn't hear anything about Queens specifically in there, but
There
I
is
will
a
say it
character
sounds
who
very
her
interesting.
name's Padmini, and
And
she is the avatar for Queens. And that leads me into how this magic system works. They call it urban fantasy. I would call it more like a action sci-fi book. But the way it works is like a really interesting I'll call it a magic system for lack of a better parallel here, but it's that in the world, if cities are old enough, have enough significant culture behind them, they come alive essentially. And when they come alive, there's a human that is selected as the avatar for the city, and they become the city personified, and they
mm,
have these abilities to connect with the city and protect it from otherworldly creatures that would seek to destroy it. There's some interdimensional warfare going on, and um, the interesting premise is that when there's enough of a culture and significance, a city becomes alive, but that enters it into this like crazy interdimensional battle cities versus these other space-like creatures described as having these long white tentacles that try and take back the city and destroy it. So New York is it takes place in modern day New York, and New York is the first city in America to become alive,
mhm.
and it's the first like living city of this era. So um it's an interesting premise on its own. And then the structure is okay, there's one primary person who is New York, and then there are five people that represent each borough. And so the story kind of goes through switching the narratives of all these people becoming like unknowingly becoming avatars for each borough and what that's like. And there's a lot of action pieces where they immediately get attacked by these creatures, and they have to fight back, and they're still trying to figure out what happens, and they're trying to find each other. And the premise is that like the city's born, but it's super vulnerable, and the only way to protect it is to get the band together and
Mm.
save the day, you know? So that's the premise. And yeah, it's a very unique magic system, Dylan. I don't know if you've experienced anything quite like it. I know I haven't really.
Yeah, well, unique was the word
Unique
that
New
was
York.
foremost. Yeah, yeah, unique New York, unique New York. Loose lips sink ships. I think that the idea of this magic system is just not like anything else I've ever heard of or
Mhm.
considered, which is unsurprising when you're talking about N.K. Jemisin, who uh, I would say is one of the great creative minds of our time. And I think all of the accolades speak to that
Mhm.
as well. All four of the Hugos, not three. And
Mm.
I think that it's super cool. I can relate to the idea of a graduate student arriving in a
In a big
city
city.
and then losing track of their name and their life history. Fort Collins, I could just hear its beating heart
I think Fort Collins is a little
Fort
longer
Collins,
to go
Colorado.
before it becomes its own city, a living city. But actually, in the book,
Okay,
it says New Orleans tried, but it failed. Like it went through the birthing
really?
process, but then the Avatar died and it failed as a city. And so that was the first one. So
Wow.
New York was the first one to kind of survive, but it's still highly vulnerable. So
I'll
no
take
other
that.
American city. Colorado's probably lower on the list than some others, but
Denver would probably happen before Fort
mhm.
Collins, but I don't know. New Orleans is an interesting one. I mean, you live
Mhm,
there, and that was, while it's a very vibrant culture in that city,
mhm,
which I guess maybe that is the primary indicator. Otherwise,
mhm,
you'd think like there's much bigger, more prominent cities in America. Like, I guess Los Angeles didn't make the cut, or
mhm.
Chicago, or
Right.
Boston. I
Right,
mean,
Baston. They're all probably
Miami.
close. And what's interesting is like I think one of the main themes of this is, gentrification. And so
Mm,
when a lot N.K. Jemisin devotes a lot of time to figuring out like what is it about a city that makes it feel alive and what gives a city life and what about New York is alive about it, and she spends a long time covering all these different New York isms, which, as two people who have had a lot of experience living on Long Island and going into the city, um,
hmm
getting some of that influence. And I had worked in Manhattan for a few years after college, so being a commuter and knowing the city like that, I think adds another level of entertainment. I feel like if you were someone who was has no experience with New York City and picks up this book, you'd still be able to enjoy it. But there's just something about like, oh, she got that like ism just right, like she
right.
talks about very specific New York things, like being frustrated about just random very New York things on the subway, or the specific bridges and directions in the Central Park. She goes at
hmm
Grand Central Station. She goes everywhere, and one of the main things she talks about is why these avatars were chosen to represent their boroughs and why the city is alive. And so she kind of taps into the heart of like there is a power when all these groups of people come together. And she's like, what makes a New Yorker? It's like, well, it's not necessarily living here your whole life. It's coming for a fresh start and like this
Mm,
world of opportunity and all of that. And of course, it's no coincidence that these mythical creatures are these long white tentacles, right? And it's also no coincidence that that kind of creature, at the very beginning, it's introduced as a woman called Woman in White, and she tries to subvert all of this cultural um, cornerstones of the city. Like we mentioned, the Bronx. Her name's Bronca. Is a art director, and one of those very early scenes is the woman in white is the she starts this coalition called like the Greater New York Association, and like she infects people, and they go in and they try to put like racist art in her art exhibit, and she says no. So then they go to social media and say, oh, they're racist against white people, they won't put our art in the exhibit. And that's kind of how they fight sometimes. Sometimes they fight physically, like throwing trains at a tentacle monster. And sometimes they fight for the culture war of, very modern, like alt-right social media stuff is a very strong presence in this, and they're fighting that war too. And so it's kind of these two fronts. So it's a very big part of that. And like, there's all this stuff about buying out properties using these shell corporations, like the Starbucks is like the channel for evil, like in some of these places, wiping out their identity and stuff like that. So it's a not subtle social commentary throughout. It's actually very, very vocal about the social commentary that N.K. Jemisin has around gentrification, especially in New York City.
Yeah, I'd be interested to read about that because N.K. Jemisin has this incredible gift to take something even as removed from our own world as her Broken Earth trilogy is,
Mhm,
despite the Earth being in the name. This
mhm,
is an entirely foreign world that we're seeing over there.
mhm,
But it's just very clear when you're reading the story that it works both as this incredible, epic, dark fantasy tale in
mhm.
addition to working as incredible social commentary. And I mean, that's the kind of stuff that's brought her to this
Oh
next
yeah.
level of
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of the awards, in terms of her recognition, all of that kind of stuff, where she's gonna write just as entertaining, just as exciting moments as any fantasy, or in this case sci-fi story, is going
Mhm.
to have, but also she's got so many deep insightful things to say. And I'm curious then, Okay, now she's actually got the playground of the world as it
Right.
is, taking place in modern day New York. How can she take that and maybe that removes some of the, I guess, distorted, like we talk about like the black mirror concept, right? Like holding up
Mm,
a distorted mirror up to society and making it unfamiliar in order to like have us better recognize what's going on with our world than we could if when we're like in the middle of it with our own like biased perspectives and views.
mm,
Here she's got a mirror that more resembles what's actually happening, and
mm.
she's got to figure out a way to get her points across while probably reaching a lot of people who come in with more preconceived notions about the direct events than they
Sure,
would have if reading the Broken Earth trilogy,
for
where they're
sure.
like, oh, wait, this is kind of like, the ways in which, like, black people have been oppressed in
Mm.
uh, the United States. You can see that in the Broken Earth trilogy, but it's not directly that.
Right,
It's a,
right. It's not
a
explicit
completely
like,
different
oh,
story. Yeah.
alt-right social media accounts are
Right.
posting about us. It's
Yes.
like this is like very direct. And I think you touched on
Yeah.
something super interesting because N.K. Jemisin is, of course, noted for her ability to like a lot of her work, especially when this book was published, she had only written 4 books, right? Only, I say. She
Mhm.
had published 4 books, 3 out of 4 won Hugos, all around cultural conflict and oppression, right? Those are kind of her big 2 themes that she takes on pretty masterfully and has studied in extreme depth. And it's interesting that this is the first book she writes after her Hugo Sweeping Broken Earth trilogy. And she even says in the acknowledgments of this book, it's been a surprise to me, and perhaps it shouldn't have been, that writing a story set in a real place, even a place that I know well, has required more research than all the other fantasy novels I've written combined.
Mhm.
And I think that's because she's really trying to embody the spirit of New York in order to make these big themes hit close to home. I think the other thing that's interesting you'll note is that her last 3 books all won Hugos, and this one did not. And you'll also note that her Goodreads rating on this book is significantly lower, still very high, but significantly lower than her other books as well. And, this isn't the book that normally would win a Hugo, and not because of its ability. I think N.K. Jemisin brings just as much talent and voice and thematic development to this book as she does to any of the one book I read, the 5th season in the Broken Earth trilogy. But this book is just much more fun. It's much more
Hmm.
action focused. A lot of the book is just action set pieces. And then, of course, she's the like symbolism is very in your face and very direct unintentionally, I think. And that brings me to the other like really interesting thing I wanted to talk about in this book, because a lot of the criticism that I see for this book, and I say criticism because it's, a Goodreads choice nominee and it's still very highly rated. It's just compared to when you sweep the Hugos, this is the
Yeah.
criticism that you get. They say that, oh, like, like all her cast is outrageously diverse. Like you have a 60-year-old gay Native American as one of your avatars, and then the other one is a gay black guy, and the other one is a black woman who was a rapper in her past life and is now a politician, and oh, the evil person is called Woman in White, and they have alt-right accounts, and I guess the lack of subtlety is what's commonly pulled into question for her, and I will admit that as I was reading it, that was like an initial gut reaction that I had too of like, wow, she's just really hamming it up and like really venting some stuff like by just going all out attack mode. And then as you read it more and more, you start to realize the underlying use of the genre that she's in. And you'll see in a lot of reviews, and even Neil Gaiman's cover blurb will say contains Lovecraftian elements. This is a Lovecraftian story. It's like H.P. Lovecraft, the famous sci-fi author. And even throughout this book, Lovecraft comes up quite a bit. And what's interesting about that to me is like there's a love for the genre, but she's very critical of Lovecraft. And even in the story, like the characters talk about him and they're like, but wasn't he like a xenophobe and just wanted an all-white
Yeah.
America and all his books were all super white and this and that. And like, yes, that's true. And when I read this, I'm like, here's what she's doing. She's taking Lovecraft, who wrote like this very monogamous, cultureless sci-fi stuff that was, beloved by people, whatever, but it's a popular genre. And here she is, and she's eliciting the same reaction on the other side. I think the thinly veiled symbolism is on purpose and is in your face on purpose because she's like, hey, this is what it's like to be on the receiving end, and here it is in full force. Like here's an ultra diverse, both in like uh gender and sexual orientation and race and all this other stuff, like as diverse as you could possibly create, and it's going to be in your face. And it won me over pretty quickly after that. Once you start reading the Lovecraftian criticisms in the book, you're like, oh, I see exactly what she's doing. She's presenting the other, she's fighting back, which is exactly what New York City is doing, fighting back against the monsters. So to me, it was a really clever use of the genre and a really creative way to take an author who maybe you like the stories, or you're influenced by the author, but their personal lives and beliefs were like super not okay. And especially when you're an author who devotes their time to talking about cultural identity and oppression, like that can be a hard line to balance. Like, how do you be influenced by and also heavily criticize someone? And I think she tackled it very well. And I think she elicited these responses that ultimately are what she's trying to do when you talk about like cultural not necessarily cultural conflict, I guess you could say. It's the conflict that comes up from being put in that position where you're reading it. And so I was very, to me, that was the most interesting part about the story beyond all the beautiful New York isms that I was able to appreciate.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think it's also the idea that creating a diverse cast to represent one of the most diverse
Right,
cities in the
of
world,
course.
right? This is New York City we're talking about. And I think that, like, if you're creating these avatars of particular areas, like they're
Mhm.
not all just going to be like me yelling about how my bagel doesn't have enough cream cheese on it. As that's why they left the avatar of Long Island off. It's like, oh, it's
Or
it's
they didn't
Dylan,
make the
it's Dylan
avatar of
Marsh,
Brooklyn like
the
Larry David or
right,
something.
right. It's Dylan Marsh, the avatar of Long Island. It's like we're keeping it to the
You think
boroughs a
Long
bit, just
Island got
like
an
I'm
avatar? No way.
no, I'm saying they didn't. It would be,
Yeah,
but it would be me yelling about my bagel not having enough cream cheese on it, and
exactly.
it's
Exactly.
like, and where's the coffee? I've been waiting for the coffee for so long, but
Right, right.
unfortunately that didn't happen. But I mean, we're talking New York City, one of the most diverse cities that you'll find, and it's sensible to have a diverse cast. And you love a diverse cast. It's just do you want to be beaten over the head with certain messages? And
Hmm.
sometimes it's like, I mean, I didn't read the book, so I don't know exactly how it was executed, but it's N.K. Jemisin. So I think you're probably right. If there were times in which you're being beaten over the head with it, it's because N.K. Jemisin wanted to beat you over the head with
Yeah,
it, because
exactly.
she's capable of incredible subtlety, as we saw in the fifth season, and you see in the later books, but she's also like extremely outspoken in her beliefs. And if she
Hmm.
wants to get her point across, and she wants to make sure like, no, there's no misunderstanding where I'm coming from right
Right,
now, then
right,
she's going to do that too, and I expect do it to great effect.
right. Exactly. And that's exactly what she does here. It's supposed to be in your face. It's supposed to be eliciting that kind of response, that knee-jerk response of like, whoa, she's really hard correcting. But what's good about it is it's at the very first, but take all the cultural themes and all the New Yorkisms, it's all in there. But the number one thing that it is, and the number one focus that I believe N.K. Jemisin had, was to have fun and write something exciting in your face and entertaining. which, as entertaining as the fifth season is, it's one of those ones, gunning for a Hugo. Whereas this, I'm sure it's like, hey, if I win a Hugo, great, but I'm gunning for entertaining people. Like this is what this book is trying to do, and that was a lot of fun to uh, to read because I loved the Broken Earth, but it wasn't like they stopped and a whole chapter was dedicated to people fighting with supernatural abilities. There's some conflict in fighting and stuff, but this is like every other chapter there's a fight, there's a action-packed thing, and they're able to take things that had any kind of significance, like the train, and like run a train line into a monster, or like whatever else they could find. Some one character takes like a newspaper and is able to like supercharge it with power because newspapers are so prevalent in the city, or whatever it is, like they're able to do those kinds of things. Taxis, all that kind of stuff takes on new power and can even in some cases be weaponized. So that was super fun. There's also a lot of really random you can tell she's having fun because she's quoting a lot of different like classic literature authors in her dialogue, and it's really random. And I had this weird moment that I couldn't. I was so like surprised that I caught this reference, and I had no one to share it with. But as you know, it is the holiday season, and literally the book right before I read The City We Became, I like to read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Right, it's only 80 pages. It's very short. It's a story I love. I read it every year, and so I read that, and then immediately started reading The City We Became. And there's a quote from Christmas Carol that is directly quoted in here, and I'm like, what the heck? Am I the only person that read these two books back to back and caught the quote? And I was like, who can I tell about this? Nobody. So I guess it's a good thing that we
You
have the
can tell an
show and maybe some.
entire audience of
Yeah.
podcast.
I was like, thank
You're
goodness I
doing it
have an
right now.
audience that might appreciate it, because there's a short quote in Christmas Carol where Scrooge sees his first ghost, right? And the ghost is like, why do you doubt your senses? And he goes, because little things can affect them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. That's the quote,
Mm.
right? And so there's this scene where one of the avatars is like fleeing a monster, and she doesn't quite understand what she's seeing, and it's just like she has been sure until this moment that this was an optical illusion, a reflection off one of the back seat windows, combined with passing shifts of sunlight, or a weird daydream. She did have corned beef hash for breakfast. Maybe the mirror stuff is undigested beef or underdone potato. And I read that, I was like,
Oh.
what the heck? Is this like the most subtle, obscure reference on the planet that only reading the two books back to back you're able to catch? And then I kind of was reading it more carefully, and there's a few other references that sound like they're quotes from other books,
Mm.
but I didn't pull any for the episode. But that one, I was like, oh my God, I read that. I was like, who do I tell? Who do I tell? I guess I'll just sit with this by myself until I
You,
can share it. Like how obscure is that? Like that's clearly a deliberate connection, right? I mean that can't be mistaken as like parallel thought, because it's clearly a undigested beef, underdone potato. Those are the exact phrases in Christmas Carol. I mean, there's no
I mean,
confusing
it's
that.
either, well, if you say there's other references to quotes from classic literature,
Mm,
then I'd say it's pretty hard to believe that this was coincidence. If it was the only one, I'd say like maybe she just read the Christmas Carol and like it was just like
right?
in her head and she didn't think but yeah, I'm probably not giving enough credit to four-time Hugo Award winning and Genius Grant
Right.
recipient N.K.
Right.
Jemisin. So I'll say
Right.
probably you're onto something there, Charles, and I'm
Right.
glad that you have this platform, if
Oh,
for
it's
nothing
such
else,
catharsis,
to
because you
yeah.
don't know the world of frustration I was in when I discovered it, and I was like, I can't explain this to anyone without going into way too much detail. But
But
that's a
there you
relief.
did.
There I did, and I did it. I was like, I
You
have
were
to, because this was just too shocking to me. It's the most obscure reference I think I've ever noticed in my career, because I read them back to back. Who else has read these two books back to back? Probably nobody. So that was my little contribution there. But yeah, to bring it all home, I would easily recommend this to anyone who has a connection to New York City, just because it's a fun read and set in New York, and you'll get to appreciate New York City in that way. fans of N.K. Jemisin's work obviously will feel at home with this one. Neil Gaiman gave it a huge glowing endorsement as well. And I don't know, I just find it super interesting. Anyone who's interested in the themes that N.K. Jemisin like boldly and masterfully takes on around again around cultural conflict or oppression, it should read this as well because I think there's more going on here than a lot of critics have um, dove into and expressed. So I'm curious to see what other people think. I think the way she's purposefully, subtly quoting authors, and she's both influenced by and fighting against Lovecraft and all these other kind of old
A
sci-fi
tonal retort.
authors. I almost was going to say tonal retort, but I don't
Yeah.
know if it is tonally a retort as much as it is like that guy is a racist and I'm gonna shove it back in his face, by writing his kind of story just as good, but with my characters and my themes fighting against him. So it's kind of interesting that you can pull that influence and also pull that conflict. But tonal
A
retort,
love
I'm
letter
still
and
trying to
breakup
figure out
letter
what
to
that, yeah.
a love letter and breakup
There,
letter to Lovecraftian literature.
yeah, that's more probably accurate. That's
Yeah.
probably more
Uh,
accurate. That's a
right.
love
Well, for
letter and
those
breakup.
who don't have all the context, so we quote it from time to time. That is what R.F. Kuang called Babel in reference to. So she called it a tonal retort to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell,
Mhm.
and then she also called it her breakup letter, yeah, like love letter and breakup letter to Oxford, where
Mhm.
she got, I think it was a master's that she got. It's hard to keep track of all of R.F. Kuang's
Her
graduate
accolades and
degrees at this
accomplishments.
point,
Yeah.
but I think she got a master's over at Oxford, and she, yeah, called Babel was very critical of like imperialism in like academic institutions, especially those we consider like highly uh, prestigious academic
Right. And there
institutions. So
is something to that, right? Which I also think N.K. Jemison's coming from, where it's like, hey, this is the world we were kind of that we live in. And it's like, yeah, what am I going to do? Not get a master's at Oxford, but also I have
mhm.
significant problems with the legacy of Oxford and it's like,
Yeah,
what it means to my cultural identity at the same time. That's a very conflicting experience to have. And so, yeah, it's in those ways, it's very similar. I think the main reason I would want to read Babel is to fully understand what a tonal retort means, because I've read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and I don't quite know what a tonal retort
well,
is. I like the
Charles.
phrase, but one day I'll get there.
Well,
I'll
that's why
read
I
it.
have to read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Because right now, Charles, I've got the retort, you've got the
I know.
original. We still don't truly understand the phrase, and we
I
use it
know.
constantly. So
We use
it's,
it constantly.
yeah,
And the love and breakup letter to it's definitely a love and breakup letter to Lovecraftian literature for sure.
yeah.
That I think
Was
could
there
get
that
the
much
FTF
love in it?
blurb. No, I mean
Just a
the only
breakup
love
letter.
is that they use the same imagery and it's the same style of story, right? So that's the love part, but she has no problems highlighting Lovecraftian's problematic views on society and like putting stuff that he would probably hate into a similar genre of story,
Yeah.
like no, and that's very purposefully done. And we know N.K. Jemisin has always been part of this, like, hey, fight back however you got to, like, do like take the advantages that you can get and also continue to like present like your themes on culture and all of that. Like, don't give up that identity at the same time. So I admire that greatly about her. It can be so hard, especially these days, to enter the conversation around culture wars and identity without being labeled like being part of this absolutely toxic discourse online. But she's
Mhm.
in the middle of it, man. She's in the thick of it. She's writing books like
Right.
this, which can be almost antagonizing sometimes. But it's all for the sake of what makes a city alive is its cultural diversity and its rich heritage, and you have to protect that. Like, what good is New York if it's just a bunch of high rises and Starbucks? You
Mm,
kill the city when you do that. And that's the whole point of this story, right? It's like you can call a place New York City, but you can kill any hope it had of living just as easily, um, and then having it be a living city. So I think that's
mm.
the really interesting point that comes across in the city we became. And I have started the second book, The
Ah.
World We Make. And I'm listening to it on audiobook. And what's interesting, it's scared the hell out of me because I didn't know it was going to have like moments where it would have like horn honking and people
Oh no,
shouting and
and you
stuff
were
like that.
driving.
So for the first like 2 hours, it's just someone narrating very masterfully. And also it's like, and then all of a sudden he became the city and he could hear the horns honking like me. And I'm like, holy crap. Like, what is, and you like people whispering. I'm like, someone like around, like what's going on? I was like, oh, this is like, they're giving me cityscape sounds. And so every once in a while it will have weird effects and like TV like audio coming through a TV sound like mer, 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 and like all that stuff every once in a while peppered in. It's like highly produced in that way. I haven't listened to a book like that in a while. I know like graphic audio is a thing. I always avoid those, but this was not labeled as graphic audio, so it was kind of surprising. I like it, but I wasn't prepared.
I've had times where I forget what song it is. It might be like a song by 21 Pilots or something, but there's like a sound that sounds exactly like police sirens, essentially. And
Oh
I'm like, oh no! Like
yeah.
if I'm driving and listening to it, I'm like, oh no! Like I'm gonna get a ticket. I'm getting pulled over. Like what do I do? But yeah, it sounds like
Oh.
that can be pretty jarring there, Charles.
Yep.
Last
But
thing that I'm curious about here, Charles, you briefly mentioned that Tulane uh, graduate,
mhm.
fellow Tulane graduate,
Yes.
N.K. Jemisin. And when I say
Yes.
fellow, I mean fellow to you. That's your
Yes.
alma
Me and
mater.
N.K.
Yes,
Jemisin are both Tulane
went
alums.
to
Yes, it's
Tulane.
true.
Yes,
Mhm.
she's much younger than you, but the you did both attend that institution,
We did.
and
We're peers in
yeah,
that way.
yeah, and she disparaged the city of New Orleans by saying that New Orleans was unable to
That's an
become a
interesting one
living city.
because the
What do
way it's
you what do you think happened there?
described, and it's not a spoiler to say this, is that she does acknowledge that New Orleans is a city rich in culture
Yeah.
and rich in identity, and it's older than the United States. So giving it the first chance to come alive is, to me, considered respect and honor to the city, right? She's like,
Ah.
hey, New Orleans had a shot, but then it's like, oh, the Avatar was kind of neglected, and then it got caught in all this crazy politics and stuff, and then it
Hmm.
it, it had this like I would compare it to a stillbirth, if you will. And that's just more of a commentary on the things that happened around Hurricane Katrina and the way the government so failed the city and the way the city has fallen into like corruption and like no long-term planning whatsoever, and its culture is just too volatile. And so I respect that as someone who also lived in New Orleans for like 6 years and then left the city. It's like, oh, it's a beautiful city that I love very, very much, but would I start a family there? Would I own property there? If I It's like, no, I don't think I would. It's too risky. Like there's no one thinking long term in that place. It's just like tourism and corrupt government, and it can be hard as much as you love the culture to invest in a town like that. So I think NK and I are on the same wavelength that we both love the city, but um, it it didn't make it into this
Hmm.
cityhood, this alive aspect of the world. And she'll even mention other cities and how successful or old or young they are. It's no spoiler to say that the second youngest city is Sao Paulo in Brazil because it's the youngest city helps the newest, like the newest city gets helped by the most
Oh,
youngest to like survive the
gotcha.
coming alive aspect. And then like that's how they kind of keep each other like, here's what's happening, you're not going crazy, like, here's what you got to do, like this, here's how it works. So Sao Paulo is a very present character in the story. So it's interesting in that way. But yeah, it's a really interesting way to take on just politics, and um, I'm trying, what's the word for it? I already said it. Where the gentrification, it's literally that. Where it's like gentrification is literally killing a city. A way to take those
Mm,
fantasy elements and bring them alive. Like what if by gentrifying a city or a borough, you could kill that borough? Like
yeah.
because like I mentioned, the war is fought on two fronts, right? There's literally throwing crap at each other and punching and kicking each other, and then there's like going on to social media, running for elections, buying property, that kind of stuff is also how they fight the war. So it was a really one of the more interesting cultural
Mm.
appropriation or which is weaponized in this quite literally, and
What-
gentrification that is weaponized quite literally in this to kill a living city.
That makes sense, Charles. How would fixing that giant pothole that was outside of your house in New Orleans, would that positively or negatively affect the city? And can you speak to the time you were on television to
Excellent. So
discuss
you
said
you must
pothole?
be referring to the time where I was on
Yes.
Pothole of the Month on the local news.
Yes.
I did have a
That is
wonderful
exactly
pothole in
what I'm
front of my
referring
apartment.
to.
I could have been the avatar of New Orleans. I think that people would have been very surprised by that. They're like, "Who's this white guy? Is the avatar of New Orleans?" But it's like, hey, I had the pothole of the month. Okay, so that's power right there. Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting because they talk about how certain things, just by nature of being so integral to the city, become a part of it. And I think for sure potholes could definitely be a device that could be used by the Avatar of New Orleans to as a either fighting back or something like that. But maybe like the lack of supporting the infrastructure could also kill them. So I guess it depends. NK Jemison's the master. I'll leave it to her. I could see it going either way. I guess it just depends on what statement you're trying to make about the state of the city. It's like, are we prideful in
Mm.
that we are scrappy and we deal with what we got? Here's a pothole to the face. Or is it like, oh no, no one's repairing our roads. My circulation is getting cut off. I'm gonna die. Which is it gonna be? And it
Hard
sounds
to
like N.K.
say.
Jemisin by killing her New Orleans avatar kind of made that statement already. But yeah, that's a good question, Dylan. I don't know. We'll have to ask N.K. Jemisin one day, and then
Yeah,
I'll
well,
attach my clip of being on the pothole of the month on the local news, just so she knows I'm for real.
yeah, I remember. I think I found the clip, like in the immediate aftermath of that, but then not long after that, the clip was nowhere to be found. So if
I
anyone
know,
can
right?
find the
They didn't
clip
archive
of,
it. Like, what's going
yeah, I
on?
know it's sad. It's lost to time.
I was just in
And
my house. I was in my pajamas or
weren't you
something,
in your?
even, and
Yeah, I was trying to
I was
remember,
in,
like in a
I was,
bathrobe or in your
I was in like a
pajamas or
hoodie and
something.
sweats, and
Oh,
some dude
okay.
knocks on my door, and I open it, and he's like, "Hi, we're so and so, a pothole of the month. Like, we noticed this big pothole in front of your house." I'm like, "Yeah, it's a pain in the ass. It's right in front of my driveway. It's been there since I moved in like a year and a half ago." And yeah, they filmed it and moved on. So yeah, great
Wasn't
segment, great city.
Yeah, wasn't there also a big pothole outside of, like, on the road at one point when I'd go down to your house that you grew up in? Wasn't there a pothole for a while there too? Like a
There may have been
pretty
on Long
bad one?
Island. There may have
Yeah.
been. I remember when we were driving together and you did get a flat tire. I remember that day.
Yes.
Um, and that was on my street, so I guess
Yeah.
there was. I don't really remember. But
Those
yeah,
potholes
potholes have
seem to
plagued
follow you
me
around.
my whole career. But I live in Atlanta now. There's not too many potholes, actually. I will say the roads here are good, but it is a very car dependent city, which I think if N.K. Jemisin were to write about it, that would be a detriment. But
Yeah. No
at
offense to
least
Atlanta,
with
but I
come
feel
cars
like,
dependency comes good roads, at least.
sure. No offense to Atlanta, but I feel like if culture is one of the, like, a vibrant, like, culture, like idiosyncratic to that particular place, is a prerequisite. Atlanta might not be among the first to become alive. I feel like it's mostly transplants, like, and they haven't really found themselves. They do have that aquarium, but we're still waiting. They'll probably beat out Fort Collins, Colorado, but maybe not by that much.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, that's true. There's not a lot of rich cultural difference, and we're a relatively new city for the United States. Also, like we're comparative to so many other
Yeah.
of the big cities. We're one of the younger ones anyway, so we've got a long ways to go. But I think it's almost too late for us. We're too separated and by roads, and it's just like, what culture do we have? We've got the
Mm.
airport. Well, like that's it. Um,
Your
strip
culture
clubs,
is
like
getting people out of there and to other places that do have culture.
yes, yes. Hey,
Sorry,
promising
Atlanta.
place for a career, like
Yeah,
good opportunities, but that does not necessarily make culture. And yeah, I'd be curious to have N.K. Jemisin kind of profile the
the
potential
cities.
avatar for Atlanta and why it wouldn't necessarily make it ascend to a live status. But that's just to speak highly to this magic system that she's created and just how fun it is to try and like give personification to your own city and why it wouldn't succeed in this and that. Like she's these very loosely constructed rules of this, I would say, soft magic system create a lot of interesting thought, and they all relate to our lives personally too, because these are real places that we, as Americans anyway, and especially us as people from the Northeast, can really closely relate to. So, um, she takes a few shots at Long Island, which I'll let slide. But
Really?
yeah, it's just being
Nice.
like, okay, that's obviously not the city, or like, or God forbid, Long Island, like they'll, it's almost like Jersey jokes, but Long Island
Yeah.
instead. And I'm like, come on, guys, like, if you're not Jersey, let's be real here. It's a little more love to Jersey also than I would expect from like
Really?
not a ton of love, but
Is
definitely more love than I would expect.
is
But
NK from New York City originally, or does she
no,
live
I
there
think
now?
she's
Like,
from she grew up in New York City, but she's from all over the
okay.
place. I'm looking at her Wikipedia now. Let's see. Born in Iowa. Um, she grew up in New York City and Mobile, Alabama. She attended Tulane from 1990 to
Mm-hmm.
94,
Right.
and
A
then she went
little
on to
younger
study
than you.
counseling. Yeah, a little
Mm-hmm.
younger. I was not even born in 1990, but that's okay. She lived in Massachusetts for 10 years, then moved to New York City, and she currently lives in New York City as well, I believe. So definitely very familiar with the city, definitely a native and
Mm.
all that. So um, yes, it was really fun, and I would recommend it to anyone who loves New York City because it is entertaining in that value alone. There's like New York City references a mile a minute. There's just so many, and it's fun for that alone.
More like a mile a New York minute, am I right? But
Oh, that's
it's
even faster.
uh, they do move fast over there in New York City,
Yeah,
if
they
I
get a
know
lot
one thing.
done.
Yeah, but all right. Well, speaking of moving fast, I don't know if we accomplished that in this episode, but
No,
I do think, have reached the a logical endpoint for
yes.
our discussion. Any final words here, Charles, or can we just head to that sweet, sweet outro music?
No, I think we're all set. Highly recommend, if it sounds remotely interesting, check it out. NK Jemisin, you can't go wrong. And we'll be back soon to finish off the Powder Mage trilogy, so you don't want to miss that. And then after that, we're going right into another exciting series of friends pitching fantasy, which I'm already starting to figure out what books I'm going to present for us to
Exciting.
read in the future. So it's all very exciting. So I think there's all that needs to be said, and all we got to do now is play that sweet, sweet outro music.
Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, everyone, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, go ahead and reach out to us over on the socials at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with number 1 on the end for Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard on the show today and they want to support us even more than engaging with us over on the socials, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify, where most of you are listening. But I do have to say, I used to say it's just 2 clicks at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed. Well, Spotify did something that I don't think is smart, but they decided that you should have to click about and then click the ratings and then give your star amount. Why are ratings under the about section on Spotify? I don't know. I don't run Spotify. I'm just a co-host of a measly fantasy podcast, but it does help us so much if you toss 5 stars to our podcast.
People to rate 5 stars? Do they not want our show to grow and prosper?
They don't seem to be very invested. I don't think the Spotify Corporation is very invested in our podcast in particular, but they seem to have made it harder for all podcasts. And anyway, go ahead and do that. We love when you do that, but we also love when you rate and review on Apple Podcasts. A little more intuitive over there, and you can write stuff and just say nice things, because that always puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Well said, Dylan. Just listening, more than enough. Thank you all so much for making it all the way to the end. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We greatly appreciate you guys. And Happy New Year. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.